As we discussed in the last DLC video, the Not a Hero DLC was a pretty good slice of content developed mainly by a third party on the original project, Hexadrive, and most importantly was released for free. So if Capcom wants to avoid looking the total fool in this whole equation, they better have brought their A game on for the End of Zoe project that they actually charge money for. Let's get started. This DLC begins with the canonical choice for the ending of the Residence chapter, when Ethan canonically chooses to save his girlfriend, leaves Zoe to die alone in the butchered halls of this once proud swamp cabin people. Having been not rescued, Zoe didn't have a chance in the slightest, and miraculously ended up getting caught out pretty much 2 minutes after Ethan left, when Eveline decided to agitate her infection and put her in a comatose state. Stupefying everyone, Zoe managed to actually not die as a result of this, and is able to be rescued later on by New Umbrella under the care of Chris's leadership on the mission. The people who rescue Zoe are a couple of faceless PMC drones who, like Zoe, get caught up in a mishap of their very own when someone new comes onto the scene to fuck shit up. This man among men is none other than the unmentioned older brother of Jack Baker. I didn't really take his name down, so we're just going to call him Chris in this video. Among a family and protagonists of what were basically a bunch of normal people getting caught up in experiments gone awry, Chris Baker easily becomes the most badass character of them all, and basically being designed as the redneck Hercules in the most literal sense. He has a Santa-branded beard, the classic poor man suspenders where one of them is comically unbuttoned, and he also lives as an alligator trader in the middle of nowhere, a few miles off his brother's land, and more importantly, he is well versed in insect consumption. Using his amazing southern pride after finding that the soldiers were helping Zoe, and totally misunderstanding the situation, Chris kidnaps the soldiers and attempts to figure out what's going on after he ties them up. The soldiers who, to be fair, at the end of the day were trying to help everybody out, decide the smartest thing to do to the 7-foot musclehead demanding answers would be to not answer anything. The soldiers decide to spend their entire time in the DLC playing the pronoun game and talking around the issue in the most infuriating of manners, because the soldiers spend a lot of time talking without actually saying anything. The easiest way to infuriate freaking anybody, especially a guy who could probably cut an alligator in half with his bare hands. Thankfully, one of the actually useful sentences to fall out of their mouths was that there was a cure, like right next door, for the Zoe disease that she has. Frankly, if Capcom had decided to take pages out of the book of Not a Hero, this DLC would have been set up for a guaranteed 7 out of 10, with a possibility for higher points. But once Chris Baker starts down the gameplay path is when Capcom tripped and fell down the stairs in terms of finding a core gameplay idea to revolve around this 90-minute DLC, and what spectacularly awful idea did they go for? First-person boxing. There was no chance for this. Capcom was doomed from the start. There are many freaking reasons why first-person fisticuffs is never going to work as a gameplay model. And the most obvious example as to why this idea is terrible was to simply ask anybody if they think a fighting game would be better in first person. A question that I think motherfucking Capcom probably could have answered their goddamn selves. There's a reason why these things have rarely been tried, and it's because it ends up being so stupidly restrictive and simply badly conceived to fighting that it should have been obvious the second that you freaking started that this was never going to freaking work. Throughout this DLC, you'll be attempting to fight the molded using only your fists, and only being allowed a gun once you get past the first go-round, and I say attempt in the most literal of terms. The problem with first-person punching is that you A, have to get really close to the target you're fighting, B, there is very little guidance from the game on where your punches are actually going to land, since you can't see your hands moving in first person, C, due to the close proximity of the player to the monsters, you'll frequently find yourself having the molded off camera, and therefore will be taking pot shots at you and beating down your health, and finally, D, basically B again, since you can't tell where your punches are going to land due to first person, you aren't going to be staring at the molded's fist as well, so trying to tell where the hitboxes are in this thing is a fool's game. Pile on top of this that the DLC has no reliable dodge mechanic other than sidestepping and hoping for the best, and the game overemphasizing the use of blocking in this combat, which obviously isn't a 100% cure for getting punched by a blob of jello and teeth, and you have an even bigger mess to deal with. Thankfully, this is sort of balanced even on normal difficulty by the game giving you lots of healing items and not hiding any of them on the critical path, since Chris is able to get on by eating crawfish and centipedes. Unfortunately, the combat system that Capcom chose to show off just how stone cold unstoppable their redneck Hercules was, ended up simply showcasing their own ineptitude at thinking any of this was going to work out well. Another massive freaking clue to continue the incompetence train was that End of Zoe also decides to dabble in a little bit of stealth. Considering the stealth that was included in banned footage and the main game, this did not go over well, especially since a lot of End of Zoe is spent in restrictive corridors anyway, so what's even the damned point? The stealth is absolute garbage, either weighing everything on the side of the monsters or the player, depending on who walked in the best direction first, and considering there's absolutely no stealth tools other than expert footwork to deal with the stealth, it ends up being very misleading with muddy mechanics and an incredibly high punishment for fucking it up that you can't get out of. If you get caught, you might as well reload the checkpoint and go for the insta-kill stealth kill on the second attempt, or the third attempt, or the 12th attempt. I don't know how much you want to deal with today. To be fair to Capcom once again, they did attempt to mix things up by integrating a couple items, such as the spear into gameplay, which if they were given out regularly, would have really livened up the gameplay model by giving the player a fuck off button in dire straits. What actually happened is that the spears became nothing more than simply an element of a larger puzzle. More often than not, Capcom sticks in the spears around alligator hotspots. Considering this is Chris's job, you think this wouldn't really be an obstacle if he took them on one at a time, but you'd be wrong because there are now Eveline's gators infected with super aggressiveness, and the gators will be able to insta-kill you for the horrendous crime of getting anywhere near them. You need the spears to strategically kill the gators and get through them, but Capcom only gives the player an exact number of spears equal to the minimum number of gators killed with them to get past the section, with none left over for dealing with the odd molded, which might actually be a good thing because in regular combat, the spears are horribly unreliable like everything else in this DLC. Unless you land a clean headshot with the spear, which is difficult in of itself, keeping in mind that you have an incredibly limited amount of them. The molded have normal-sized heads, and they keep bobbing around in unpredictable patterns, so getting a clean kill with them is really hard, and if you get a body shot, they basically do no damage. And since we're talking about later down the line, let's talk about the times that End of Zoe tried to have boss fights as well. They sucked, universally. Hell, at one point it got so bad with the final boss that I actually took the game's offer of health and dropped the difficulty because it was getting so bad that if the literal first action you did was not blocking when you reloaded the fight, the final boss had the ability to pretty much kill you with its first attack. The regular combat of this DLC was horse-ass, but somehow the boss fights brought things up to an even more ludicrous brand of awful diarrhea. Again, the problem is that you are forced to be really close to an enemy that you can't see very well and can't dodge around, so trying to read their tells is hard enough before asking you to start strategizing around them and getting your shots in. And the bosses have tons of health in multiple phases without checkpoints in between, so being on your A game to keep yourself trucking in the face of so many parts of the game working against you to. It was no wonder these were my least favorite bosses in the whole freaking game. I'll tell you that about the halfway point in the DLC, I was getting through every encounter basically mashing heavy attacks, since the combo system the game has is also heartily misfiring all the time. Mostly because of that irritating general problem of all the video games, where your first hits with the combo end up pushing your target out of the range of your finishing blow, so you use all this time setting up the perfect punches to get that sweet boost of damage at the end, which has a good chance of just melting away in your hands because the game is staggering the enemies so freaking much. Just mash heavy and wait for whatever you're fighting to fall over. You pretty much have an equal chance of getting a stagger on an enemy if you went for the combo. The gameplay idea is universally horrible, but Capcom did eventually fix it by throwing the entire idea out the window and giving the player a massive fuck you button to the enemies in the game, and that was when Chris Baker found Umbrella's Power Glove. This thing ups Chris's fist damage output by a silly multiplier. On a full charge, the Power Glove will turn regular enemies to giblets in a single blow, which would have been a lot more fun to have if it wasn't given mere minutes away from the final confrontation with Jack Baker, who in this DLC somehow got reincarnated as a swamp monster instead of a giant pile of goo. He wasn't really downgraded in power per se, which is why it's hard to deal with him. It's difficult to see his tells, difficult to dodge his attacks. You have to wait forever for an opening to appear in which Jack will actually be able to accept the damage being thrown by the Power Glove, which makes it an aggravating mess of a boss fight that isn't satisfying in the slightest. Sorry for not talking about the plot of the DLC very much in this video. It's something I usually focus on because I'm that sort of gamer, but the problem is that what Chris is doing in the DLC is incredibly basic. He explores weird haunted places on the bayou, chasing down the cure for Zoe, and then Zoe herself when she gets kidnapped by the brother that he apparently liked punching when they were kids, because that's really fun to know. At least now that Jack has finally been defeated and captured by New Umbrella, Zoe gets her cure, and after a New Umbrella checkup, man, maybe this whole reform company thing is actually working out. I'm still holding my breath for when the shoe drops, honestly. But after that, they'll finally be able to go back to some sort of home and live out the rest of their days alone with each other. The DLC pretty much ends on a happily ever after and leaves the audience with blue balls. Suffice it to say that the DLC is short, not that substantial in any content, with a bafflingly bad gameplay model in first-person boxing, which doesn't work at the best of times and relies on butchered stealth to fill in the gaps. The locales that Chris goes to are not interesting. The one unique monster the DLC has is also really boring. There are no real villains besides the mindless going around, so fighting them isn't actually satisfying. And even then, can you really bring yourself to continually bash your head against the wall on their fights before accepting the dreaded difficulty downgrade? I'll tell you, I highly considered it a couple of times before I picked the option right at the end of the DLC. Chris Baker, Redneck Hercules, is a great character though. He has that Kratos-styled singular driving motivation, accompanied by his insane physical prowess, that just makes it fun to see him go hell to leather against anything that's coming against him, just to get the thing that he wants, and then he's able to just punch his way through all of his problems. He's a powerful, unstoppable badass with those naturist skills and a nice touch of the redneck stereotype to round out his character into a previously unmentioned Baker family member. Plus, come on, you can't hate someone with that crazy of a beard. It's just not possible. It's too bad Capcom couldn't get him into a better project. To sum up End of Zoe, Not a Hero was released for free, not developed by Capcom, and was of significantly higher quality and creativity in comparison to this mystifying mess of gameplay that was short, didn't do anything, and didn't have any characters put in or extra assets to make it pop off the screen, and somehow Capcom decided to charge money for this. Not a Hero was the goody good DLC. and End of Zoe was the bad one, due to the just simple act of asking for money for it. Honestly, I would out and out recommend skipping it, even if you did get the complete edition. It's just not worth the time spent in dealing with its freaking bullshit.